My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 33 years old, and I own 3 restaurants across 2 states, including the one my own family mocked me for, waitressing at during my cousin's wedding, the same restaurant where, 6 months later, my father would sit at a corner table, order the $58 dry-aged ribeye, and complain to the manager about the service, not realizing the manager reported directly to me. Let me give you that moment first, the one that started it all, because I think you deserve to see it before I take you back to the beginning. It was June 21st, 2025, at the Hillcrest Manor Banquet Hall outside Albany, New York, my cousin Danielle's wedding reception. String lights strung across a tent that smelled like peonies and warm butter, 210 guests in their best clothes. I was wearing a simple navy dress and flats because I'd come straight from a 6 a.m. inventory delivery at my flagship location. My Aunt Carol leaned toward my mother, loud enough for the table to hear over the band, and said, "Well, at least Vanessa found steady work. Waitressing keeps you humble, I suppose." My own mother laughed. "I want you to sit with that for 1 second. My own mother laughed, before I tell you that the restaurant she meant, the one I supposedly waitressed at, had done $2.3 million in revenue that year, and I owned 100% of it. If you're watching this right now, do me a favor before we go further. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one of them, and this story is going to take a while to tell properly, so if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because you will not want to miss where this ends up. Let me take you back to where this really started, long before Hillcrest Manor, long before the ribeye, back to a small town called Everton Mills, about 40 minutes outside Syracuse, where I grew up in a narrow blue house on Larkspur Avenue with my parents, Diane and Harold Cole, and my older brother Marcus. Marcus was 3 years older than me, and from the time I could form memories, Marcus was the center of gravity in our house. He was the athlete, the one whose Little League trophies lined the mantel, the one whose report cards got taped to the refrigerator even when they were mediocre, because, as my father put it, the boys got heart, that's what matters. I got good grades too, better than Marcus's, if I'm honest, consistently on the honor roll from 4th grade onward, and my report cards went into a kitchen drawer, unmentioned, filed away like paperwork nobody needed to look at twice. My father managed the parts counter at a regional auto supply distributor, a steady but modest job that paid around $41,000 a year through most of my childhood. My mother worked the front desk at a pediatric dental practice. We were not wealthy. Every dollar in our house had a job before it was spent, and in the Cole household, an outsized share of those dollars went toward Marcus. Travel league fees, a used pickup truck for his 16th birthday, cleats, bats, tournament entry fees that sometimes ran into the hundreds. I got a hand-me-down bicycle with a chain that skipped every 3rd rotation, and when I asked my father to fix it, he told me he'd get to it, and never did. I found my own outlet, and it had nothing to do with sports. At 12 years old, I started helping out at my grandmother's diner, a 22-seat place called Ruthie's on Main Street in Everton Mills, named after my great-grandmother. I bussed tables at first, then learned to run the register, then started quietly noticing things nobody had asked me to notice, that the Tuesday lunch rush was being understaffed by one person every single week, that the produce order from the regional supplier had crept up 11% in cost over 8 months without anyone renegotiating, that the specials board never changed and regulars had started ordering the same 3 items on rotation out of habit rather than desire. By 15, I had rebuilt my grandmother's ordering spreadsheet from scratch on a library computer because we didn't have one at home, and found $6,800 a year in unnecessary supplier costs. My grandmother hugged me and told me I had restaurant blood. My father, when I mentioned it at dinner, said, "That's nice, Vanessa, but real money's in trades, not in some diner." Marcus, sitting across from me, was in the middle of describing his batting average from that week's game, and the conversation simply moved back to him, the way conversations in our house always eventually did. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters for everything that comes after. I did not hate my family during those years. I loved them, actually, in the aching, hopeful way you love people who make you feel invisible. I just wanted, more than almost anything, to matter to them the way Marcus mattered without trying. That wanting became the quiet engine underneath almost every decision I made for the next 15 years. I got into a state university on a partial academic scholarship along with student loans that would take me 9 years to pay off, and I chose hospitality management and business as my major, over my father's mild objections that it wasn't a real career. My parents did not attend my scholarship award ceremony my senior year of high school. Marcus had a regional baseball tournament that same weekend, 4 hours away, and naturally, that's where the family went. I stood on that stage alone, accepted a $12,000 renewable scholarship, and looked out at an audience that did not contain a single person related to me. College is where I started working real restaurant floors, not my grandmother's cozy diner, but a mid-scale steakhouse chain near campus, where I worked my way from server to shift lead to assistant manager over 3 years, learning food cost percentages, labor scheduling, vendor negotiation, and the particular psychology of a dining room on a Friday night. I graduated in 2014 with a business degree and immediately took a management position at a 12-location restaurant group based in Syracuse, starting at $38,000 a year, a number that felt enormous to me at the time. I called home to share the news. My mother's response was, "That's nice, honey. Did you hear Marcus made varsity assistant coach at the high school?" Marcus, by that point, was 26 years old, working part-time at the same auto parts distributor as my father, coaching Little League on weekends, and living in the basement apartment of my parents' house rent-free, an arrangement everyone in the family referred to as temporary for going on 4 years. I remember that call clearly. A Thursday evening, April 10th, 2014. I was standing in my 600-square-foot rental in Syracuse, a converted attic unit with slanted ceilings so low I had to duck near the windows, holding the phone against my shoulder while I ate reheated rice out of a plastic container, because that's what $38,000 a year looked like once rent and loan payments were accounted for. I remember thinking, I just told my mother I got a real management job with a real company, and she wants to talk about my unemployed older brother getting an unpaid coaching title. That was the year I started what I privately called the ledger. Not a literal document yet, just a mental tally of every dismissal, every unequal celebration. Every time my milestones were met with a shrug while Marcus's smallest achievements were met with pride. I didn't know yet that this ledger would, one day, become something very real, kept in a drawer in my office, full of screenshots and printed emails, waiting for a day I couldn't yet imagine. Over the next 6 years, I moved fast. By 2017, I was a district manager overseeing 4 locations, making $71,000 a year. By 2019, I'd left that company to become general manager of a struggling but promising farm-to-table restaurant in downtown Syracuse called The Hollow, brought in specifically to fix its finances, which were bleeding roughly $14,000 a month when I arrived. Within 8 months, I'd renegotiated 3 vendor contracts, redesigned the menu around a leaner, higher-margin structure, and turned The Hollow profitable for the first time in 2 years. The owner, a semi-retired investor named Walter Prentice, was so impressed that in 2020, when he decided to fully exit the restaurant business, he offered to sell me The Hollow directly, financing 40% of the purchase himself because, as he told me over coffee one October morning, "You're the only person who's ever made this place make sense on paper." I bought The Hollow for $340,000 in December 2020, using $80,000 of my own savings, an SBA loan for the remainder, and Walter's seller finance note. I renamed it Larkspur, after the street I grew up on, and within 18 months I had grown its annual revenue from $780,000 to $1.4 million. I did not tell my family the details. By that point, our relationship had cooled into a kind of formal politeness. A phone call on birthdays, an obligatory appearance at Thanksgiving, conversations that skated along the surface of things and never went deeper. When I did mention, briefly at a family dinner in early 2021, that I now own my own restaurant, my father's response was, "Owned, or you're managing it for somebody." "Because those aren't the same thing, Vanessa." I told him I owned it outright. He nodded slowly, the way you nod at a claim you've decided not to believe, and asked Marcus how the batting cages business he was thinking about starting was coming along. Marcus had been thinking about that business for 2 years, funded partly by an $18,000 loan from my parents that everyone understood, without saying it aloud, would never be repaid. The trigger moment, the one that would end up costing me my family for years, arrived in September 2021. Marcus's batting cage venture had, predictably, never launched, and he'd instead run up $23,000 in credit card debt trying to test the market with a mobile batting cage trailer that broke down twice and was eventually repossessed. My parents came to me in October, and my father, in that overly casual tone he used whenever he was building up to ask for something, said, "Vanessa, we need you to co-sign a business loan for Marcus. $60,000. Give him a real shot at the batting cage thing, done properly this time, with an actual facility. You've got the credit, the restaurant's doing well, this would mean everything to this family." I asked to see a business plan. There wasn't a real one, just a folder of vague projections and a list of equipment costs with no revenue assumptions behind them. I asked what happened to the trailer venture. My father said Marcus had learned a lot from that failure, the same thing he'd said about 2 prior ventures that had also failed and also cost my parents money they didn't really have. I said no. I said it calmly, the way I'd learned to say things in board meetings and vendor negotiations, not cruelly, but firmly, with reasoning behind it. I told my parents I would help pay for a small business counselor for Marcus, or help him build an actual viable plan I could evaluate honestly. But I would not co-sign a $60,000 loan for a venture with no plan and a track record of failure, risking my own credit and the restaurant I'd built from nothing. The silence on the phone lasted, I remember, close to 10 seconds. "So that's it," my father said. "That's your answer. After everything this family has done for you." He didn't name a single specific thing. There wasn't one to name. And I let the sentence sit there, unchallenged, the way I always had, because some part of me still believed that arguing back would only confirm whatever unflattering story they'd already built about me. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, my mother called. Marcus's credit card debt had apparently worsened. Collectors were calling the house, and somehow, in the story my parents had constructed, this was my fault. If I'd simply said yes, none of it would be happening. "You've always thought you were better than this family," my mother said, her voice trembling with something almost triumphant, like she'd been waiting years to say it out loud. "Ever since you got that scholarship, ever since you started acting like some big restaurant tycoon, you've looked down on us. Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you wanted." I asked her quietly if she meant that. "You were never really one of us, Vanessa," she said. "You always acted like you were above this family, and now you finally get to prove it." I did not cry on that call. I want to be honest with you, because there's a version of the story where I break down sobbing and beg for forgiveness, and that is not what happened. Something in me went very still, the way a lake freezes from the surface downward. I said, "Okay, Mom," and I hung up the phone, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without moving, listening to the refrigerator hum in the quiet. If any of this is landing close to home for you right now, I want you to know I see you, and I'd love to hear a little of your own story in the comments below. In the weeks that followed, the silence hardened into something formal. My father sent one email, 3 sentences long, informing me I wouldn't be welcome at Thanksgiving that year, or, he suspected, for a good while, and asking that I not reach out to Marcus directly, since it was too painful for him right now. Marcus, who owed $40,000 collective dollars across 2 failed ventures and had never once, in 3 attempts, produced a real business plan. It was in that stretch of silence that I met the woman who would become the emotional anchor I hadn't realized I needed. Her name was Ruth Bennett, a retired restaurant consultant in her early 60s who'd been quietly advising Walter Prentice before I bought Larkspur, and who I'd kept on in an informal capacity, paying her a modest monthly retainer just to have someone experienced to call when I hit a wall. Ruth noticed, that autumn, that I'd started staying later and later at the restaurant, that I'd stopped mentioning my family at all in our conversations, where I once had. She showed up at Larkspur on a slow Tuesday night in November, sat at the bar until close, and finally said, with the bluntness I'd come to love her for, "You've been running from something for 2 months, and I don't think it's inventory costs. You want to tell me, or should I just sit here until you do?" I told her everything. Ruth didn't tell me my family was wrong, not directly. She was too sharp for easy validation, but she asked me the kind of questions that helped me see my own worth reflected back clearly. "If a young manager came to you with this exact situation," she asked, "would you tell her that her no was unreasonable?" I would not have. I knew that, even then, sitting at my own bar in the restaurant I owned outright. By the spring of 2022, I'd thrown myself fully into growing Larkspur, partly out of genuine ambition, and partly as a place to put everything I didn't want to feel. I opened a second location in Rochester that April, a $290,000 build-out I financed through a combination of Larkspur's retained earnings and a small business line of credit. I hired a general manager to run daily operations at both sites while I focused on strategy, supplier relationships, and what would eventually become a real restaurant group. I did not tell my family any of this. I did not know, in that spring of 2022, sitting in my office above the Larkspur kitchen with the smell of searing butter drifting up through the floor vents, that within 3 years I would own 3 restaurants worth well over $2 million combined, that my cousin Danielle would get married at a venue that happened to source its entrees through a supplier I'd later acquire, and that my own family would sit at a wedding reception mocking me for waitressing, utterly unaware that the woman they were laughing at owned every plate on that table. All I knew, that spring, was that I had said no to one loan, and in exchange, I had lost my family for what I assumed, at the time, might be forever. What I did not yet understand was that I had also said yes, without meaning to becoming a woman they would not recognize when they finally came looking for her again, and that when they did, it would not be out of love. There's a particular texture to being cut off from your family that nobody warns you about. It isn't a single wound. It's 1,000 small ones, arriving at odd moments over months. It was the 4th of July in 2022, scrolling past a photo Danielle had posted of a family barbecue in my parents' backyard, the same cracked concrete patio I'd grown up eating hot dogs on. Everyone smiling, a caption that read, "Missing a few faces but grateful for the ones here," and understanding that I was the missing face nobody had bothered to actually miss out loud. It was my birthday that August, turning 30, spent quietly with Ruth Bennett and my general manager at a corner table at Larkspur after close, a bottle of decent Cabernet, and a slice of the burnt honey cake our pastry chef had started putting on the menu, and receiving no call, no text, not even the perfunctory one-line message my mother used to send. It was smaller than a rupture and larger than an absence, and it accumulated. I started, that summer, keeping the ledger for real. Not out of vengeance. I want to be clear about that, because at the time it genuinely wasn't about revenge. It was about self-preservation. Ruth had suggested it, actually, in her characteristically dry way. Write it down, all of it, dates and numbers. Not because you'll ever use it, necessarily, but because when people spend years rewriting your reality, it helps to have your own version documented somewhere real. I bought a plain black 3-ring binder from an office supply store on Erie Boulevard, and I started printing emails, screenshotting texts, jotting down the exact dollar figures every time family money moved in one direction and never the other. The $18,000 loan to Marcus for the batting cage business that never materialized into cages. The $6,000 my parents had put toward Marcus's rent during a stretch when he claimed to be between jobs. A stretch that lasted, on and off, for nearly 3 years. The engagement ring my father had helped Marcus finance for a relationship that ended 8 months later, money nobody ever mentioned again. Next to each entry, in blue pen, I wrote the corresponding thing that had been said or not said about my own milestones during that same window, my promotion to district manager, unmentioned at a family dinner, my purchase of Larkspur, met with suspicion about whether I really owned it, my 30th birthday unacknowledged entirely. The restaurant business, in the meantime, would not slow down long enough for me to feel sorry for myself, which in hindsight was probably its own kind of mercy. By the fall of 2022, Larkspur's original Syracuse location was doing $1.6 million a year, and the Rochester location, still finding its footing, had crossed $900,000 in its first full year of operation. I brought on a part-time bookkeeper, a sharp young woman named Priya Nair, fresh out of an accounting program, who reminded me uncomfortably of myself at that age. Quietly excellent, visibly in use to anyone noticing. I made a point of noticing. I gave her a raise before she asked for one, something nobody had ever done for me, and something I decided, in that moment, would become a permanent habit in how I ran things. It was Priya, actually, who first flagged the opportunity that would change the entire trajectory of what I was building. In January 2023, a struggling but well-located steakhouse in downtown Albany came up for sale after its owner, a man in his 70s named Frank DeSalvo, decided to retire without a succession plan. The place was called the Corner House. It had been operating since 1987, and despite a loyal older clientele, it was hemorrhaging roughly $9,000 a month due to bloated labor costs, an outdated menu, and a lease that hadn't been renegotiated in over a decade. Frank wanted $625,000 for the business and its remaining lease, a price that scared off 2 previous prospective buyers. I drove up in my 6-year-old Honda Accord, because even by then I hadn't developed a taste for spending money on things that didn't directly serve the business, and spent 4 hours walking the space with Frank, going through his books line by line at his kitchen table while his wife made us coffee. I saw exactly what was wrong with it, and exactly how fixable it was. I offered $540,000, financed through a combination of an SBA loan, a modest cash reserve Larkspur had built up, and for the first time, an outside investor, Walter Prentice, my old mentor from the Hollow days, who put in $150,000 in exchange for a 15% minority stake, telling me over the phone, "I backed you once for $40,000 and got it back tenfold in referrals alone. I'll take this bet every time, Vanessa." Frank accepted. I closed on the Corner House in March 2023, renamed it Hillcrest Table, a name I'd chosen, if I'm honest, half because it sounded elegant and half because Hillcrest Manor, the venue where Danielle would eventually get married, was less than 2 miles away, and I liked the idea of my restaurant sitting quietly in the same neighborhood as the family who didn't know it existed. Within a year, I'd cut labor costs by 14% through smarter scheduling, redesigned the menu around a smaller, higher-margin selection of steaks and seasonal sides, and grown revenue from a shrinking $980,000 to a stable $1.9 million. By the time Danielle's wedding rolled around in June 2025, Hillcrest Table was doing north of $2.3 million a year, and it was, without any of my family's knowledge, the exclusive off-premises catering partner for exactly one venue in the region. Hillcrest Manor, the very banquet hall where my Aunt Carol would lean across a reception table and tell my mother that waitressing keeps you humble. I hadn't planned that coincidence. It had simply happened, the way good business does when you're paying enough attention. Hillcrest Manor's events coordinator had reached out to me directly in late 2024, having heard through industry channels that Hillcrest Table produced the best banquet-scale filet in the region, with no idea that the restaurant's owner shared a surname and blood with a family that would soon be seated in that very room. I hadn't been planning to attend Danielle's wedding at all, if I'm honest. Danielle and I had never been close. She was Aunt Carol's daughter, 7 years younger than me, and our relationship had mostly consisted of polite nods at holiday gatherings before everything went quiet. But my mother had called in April, in a tone that suggested this was less an invitation and more a test, to see whether I would finally act like part of this family again, and some old, worn-down part of me, the part that still hadn't fully let go of wanting to belong, said yes before I'd thought it through. I arrived at Hillcrest Manor on June 21st, 2025, in a plain navy dress and flats, having come straight from a 6 a.m. produce delivery inspection at Hillcrest Table that morning, dressed for comfort rather than spectacle because I genuinely expected to slip in, sit quietly and slip out. I did not expect, walking into that tent strung with peonies and string lights, to recognize the plating on the appetizer course as my own restaurant's design, prepared that week by my own kitchen staff, delivered under a catering contract signed 4 months earlier by an events coordinator who had no idea what she'd set in motion. I sat at a table near the back with a handful of distant cousins, watched my father give a toast about family being the only thing that really matters in this life, watched Marcus, now 36 and still living in my parents' basement, dance with a woman he introduced as his new business partner in something he described vaguely as e-commerce, and watched, when the entree plates came out, the ribeye I had personally approved the sourcing for 2 years earlier, my Aunt Caroline, toward my mother with a smile that had clearly been waiting for an opening. "Well," Carol said, loud enough for our end of the table to hear over the band, gesturing faintly toward me with her wine glass, "at least Vanessa found steady work. Waitressing keeps you humble, I suppose." My mother laughed. Not a polite, deflecting laugh. A real one, the kind that comes easily when you believe, all the way down, that what you're laughing at is true. I didn't correct her. I want to be honest about that, because there's a version of the story where I stand up right then, at that table, and announce who I really am and what I really own, and that is not what happened, and I don't think it would have been the right moment even if I'd wanted to. Instead, I smiled, said something forgettable about how someone's got to keep the wine glasses full, and let the moment pass the exact way I'd let 100 moments like it pass over the previous 4 years. But something had shifted in me at that table, quietly, the way tectonic plates shift long before anyone on the surface feels the earthquake. I drove home from Hillcrest Manor that night with the windows down, the June air smelling like cut grass and distant rain, and I thought about the blue 3-ring binder sitting in my office desk drawer, for years' worth of dates and dollar figures and unanswered calls, and I thought about the fact that within 6 months, per the standard renewal terms in the catering contract I'd signed, Hillcrest Manor's board would be sitting across from me. Not my family, but me, the owner, to negotiate next year's exclusive vendor agreement. I didn't know yet exactly how it would unfold. I didn't know that my father would walk into Hillcrest table for dinner 8 months later, unannounced, to celebrate a work anniversary, and order the very same $58 ribeye and complain to a young server about slow service, unaware that the general manager he'd soon be speaking to reported directly to his own daughter. I didn't know that Marcus's newest venture would collapse within the year in a way that would, once again, land squarely at my parents' door asking for money. I didn't know, driving home that night with the windows down, just how completely the ground was about to shift beneath the family that had laughed at me across a wedding dinner table. All I knew was that I had spent 4 years being erased from a family story, quietly building something real in the meantime, and that the woman who walked out of Hillcrest Manor that night was not the same one who had walked in. She was steadier, colder in the useful places, and for the first time in a long time, patient in a way that felt less like forgiveness and more like waiting. The days after Danielle's wedding folded quietly back into the rhythm of running 3 restaurants, and I let them. I didn't call my parents to correct what Carol had said. I didn't send Danielle a pointed message about who had catered her reception. I went back to Hillcrest table on Monday morning, walked the walk-in cooler with my chef to check the Friday delivery, and spent the afternoon reviewing labor percentages with Priya, who had by then become my full-time controller across all 3 locations. If anyone at Larkspur or Hillcrest table noticed that their owner had come back from a family wedding a little quieter than usual, they didn't say so, and I didn't explain. Year 1 of real silence, if I'm marking it from that October phone call in 2021 rather than the wedding, had been about survival. Learning how to exist in a body that still, some mornings, woke up expecting a text that wasn't coming. Year 2 was about proving something, mostly to myself, that I didn't need the proof I'd spent my whole life chasing. Year 3, 2023, was the year Hillcrest table turned its first real profit under my ownership, the year Priya came on staff full-time, the year I stopped, almost without noticing, waiting for my phone to buzz with a family name attached to it. By 2024, 3 years into the silence, the shape of my life looked almost nothing like the one I'd left behind in Everton Mills. I was overseeing $4.6 million in combined annual revenue across Larkspur's 2 locations and Hillcrest table. I'd hired a regional operations director, a steady, unflappable man named Dennis Ruiz, to handle day-to-day logistics so I could focus on growth strategy and vendor relationships. I'd bought a house, not extravagant, a renovated 4-bedroom colonial about 15 minutes from Hillcrest table, purchased for $470,000 in cash from a refinancing of Larkspur's earnings, the first major purchase in my life that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with simply liking a house with a wraparound porch and good morning light in the kitchen. The binder kept growing too. It wasn't dramatic. Most weeks, an email forwarded from my mother to a cousin, accidentally CCNG me, asking whether Vanessa's little restaurant thing is actually making any money, or is she just getting by? A voicemail from my father in March 2023, the only call he made that entire year, not to check in, but to ask, stiffly, whether I'd be willing to help out with a property tax bill on the house I grew up in, since family helps family, even when there's been some distance. I hadn't sent money that time. I'd sent, instead, a short, polite text explaining that I wished them well but wasn't in a position to help with that request, a boundary I'd learned from Ruth Bennett, who had a phrase for it she used often. No is a complete sentence, Vanessa. You don't owe anyone a paragraph. Ruth had become, by then, more than a neighbor and informal advisor. She sat on Hillcrest table's small advisory board, unofficially, offering guidance whenever I hit a wall I couldn't see past on my own. It was Ruth who talked me through the decision to bring on Walter Prentice as a minority investor rather than take on more debt. It was Ruth who sat with me the night in April 2024 when Priya flagged an anomaly in Larkspur Rochester's books, our assistant manager quietly skimming from the register, roughly $11,000 over 14 months, and helped me think through firing someone for the first time in my career without losing sleep over it. "You built something real," she told me that night, over decaf at my kitchen table. "Real things sometimes have rot in them. Cutting it out isn't cruelty. It's stewardship. If any of you have ever had to build something entirely without the family that was supposed to be your foundation, you understand that particular loneliness, and also the particular strength that grows out of it. Drop a comment if that's you. I read everyone." Marcus, meanwhile, had gone through 2 more failed ventures by the end of 2023. The e-commerce partnership he'd mentioned at Danielle's wedding, reselling discounted sporting goods through an online storefront, collapsed within 5 months after he and his business partner, a woman named Kayla he'd met through a mutual friend, had sunk roughly $14,000 into inventory that never sold at the margins they projected. My mother mentioned it once, on one of the rare occasions she still called, framing it not as Marcus's failure but as bad luck. The market just wasn't there for him. I said very little. I'd learned, by then, that engaging with that particular narrative only ever cost me energy I needed elsewhere. By early 2024, my father's hardware distribution job had been quietly phased out after the regional company he worked for was acquired by a larger competitor and consolidated its Everton Mills location. He was 61, without much of a retirement fund, working part-time at a different auto parts counter for considerably less money, a fact I learned not from him but from a cousin's Facebook comment I stumbled across during an idle scroll one evening. I sat with that information for a long time. Some old, stubborn part of me wanted to reach out, wanted to offer help the way I once had for Kimberly. No, that's the other story, forgive me. I mean the way I once had offered, quietly, to help pay for a business counselor for Marcus. But Ruth's voice was in my head by then too, steady and unsentimental. You can care about someone's hardship and still refuse to be the only shock absorber for choices you didn't make. I didn't reach out. It was one of the harder decisions I made that year, and also, I think, one of the correct ones. The reconnection trigger, the thing that would eventually pull my family back toward me, though not for any reason I would have wished for, started small, the way these things usually do, in the fall of 2024. A regional business journal, the Central New York Enterprise Review, had been doing a feature series on women-owned businesses expanding across upstate New York, and a reporter named Jenna Okafor reached out to me in September, having heard about Hillcrest Table's turnaround from a mutual contact in the local restaurant association. I agreed to the interview mostly because Priya thought the exposure would help with an upcoming expansion into a 4th location we've been quietly scouting in Rochester. The piece ran in October 2024, a full page, with a photograph of me standing in Hillcrest Table's dining room, arms crossed, in front of the exposed brick wall we'd restored during the 2023 renovation. The headline read, "From one restaurant to a growing regional group, how Vanessa Cole turned around a dying steakhouse." The article mentioned, in passing, that I also owned Larkspur's 2 Syracuse area locations and cited a combined group revenue approaching $5 million annually. I didn't think much of it at the time. Regional business journals aren't exactly viral content. But Everton Mills, and the small network of towns around it, ran on the kind of social fabric where everyone eventually sees everything, sooner or later, through someone who knows someone. It took until January 2025, 3 months, for the article to make its way through a chain of mutual acquaintances I never fully traced, to my cousin Danielle, who was at that point deep in wedding planning and had, apparently, mentioned to her events coordinator at Hillcrest Manor that she had a cousin somewhere in the restaurant business too. The events coordinator, without any awareness of the family connection, replied that Hillcrest Manor's catering partner, Hillcrest Table, was run by a woman named Vanessa Cole, and did Danielle happen to know her? Danielle, I'd later learn, forwarded the Business Journal article to my mother with a single line. "Isn't this Vanessa?" I don't know exactly what was said in the family group chat that followed. That particular text thread was one I was never part of by design, ever since the fallout, but I know because Ruth heard it secondhand from a mutual acquaintance who still had one foot in Everton Mill social circles, that the reaction wasn't warmth. It was, from what I gathered, something closer to disbelief, followed quickly by a kind of recalculating silence, the sound of people quietly revising a story they'd told themselves for years. My mother sent a text on February 3rd, 2025, the first direct message from her in over 3 years. It read, "Saw the article about your restaurants. Very impressive. We should catch up sometime. No apology. No acknowledgement of the 4-year silence, the October phone call, the words about not really being one of us. Just very impressive." The same phrase, I noted wryly to Ruth over dinner that week, you might use about a stranger's accomplishment rather than your own daughter's. I didn't respond right away. I sat with that text for 2 full days, turning it over the way I'd turn over an unusual line item on a balance sheet, looking for what it actually represented rather than what it claimed to be. Eventually I sent back a short, neutral reply. Thanks. Things have been going well. I did not offer an invitation to catch up. I did not open a door wider than the crack that text required. That spring, the contact from my family increased in a slow, deliberate way that I recognized, professionally, as the pattern of someone testing whether a relationship could be reopened on favorable terms. My father sent a message in March, casual, asking how the restaurant business was going, a question that would have been unthinkable from him 3 years earlier, when restaurants weren't a real career in his eyes. Marcus, who I hadn't heard from directly in over 3 years, sent a friend request on social media in April with no message attached, which I left unanswered for a full month before finally accepting, mostly out of curiosity about what I'd find on his profile, which turned out to be a series of posts about a new venture, something called a consulting service for aspiring entrepreneurs, an idea that struck me, given his own track record, as almost too on the nose to be real. By May 2025, my mother had called twice, both times landing on my voicemail because I let them, both times leaving messages that were friendly, almost bright, entirely unmoored from the 4 years of silence that preceded them, as though the estrangement had simply been a scheduling issue rather than a choice she'd made and a sentence she'd spoken on purpose. Just wanted to say hello, honey. We'd love to see you sometime, maybe at Danielle's wedding in June if you're free. That was the invitation that had originally reached me, not directly, I'd learn later, but through my mother relaying Danielle's invitation, wrapped in a warmth that hadn't existed in years, timed precisely to align with the same season the article had surfaced. I went to that wedding, as I've told you, still not fully certain why, except that some old, worn-down hope in me had never entirely died, even after everything. And I sat through Carol's comment about waitressing and my mother's laugh, and I understood something in that exact moment that I don't think I'd let myself fully understand before. They hadn't reconnected because they missed me. They'd reconnected because they'd learned, through an accident of small-town gossip, that the daughter they'd erased had built something worth noticing, and Carol's comment that night, "Waitressing keeps you humble," wasn't really contempt. It was defense, the automatic flinch of people protecting a story they weren't ready to let go of yet, even as the evidence against it sat 2 miles from their reception hall, plated on their own dinner table. I drove home that night, as I told you, with the windows down, and I made a decision somewhere on Route 20, in the dark, past the turnoff for Everton Mills that I no longer took. I decided I wasn't going to correct them. Not yet, not out of cruelty, and not really out of strategy either, at least not at first. Simply because I understood, the way you understand a slow leak before it becomes a flood, that the truth was going to reach them on its own timeline, and that timeline was already in motion, set loose by an events coordinator's routine question and a cousin's careless text, long before I decided anything at all. The months after the wedding moved the way they always had. Inventory, payroll, the slow, steady climb of 3 restaurants toward a 4th. Except now, underneath the ordinary rhythm of my days, there was a low hum of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. My father's work anniversary dinner reservation came through Hillcrest Table's online booking system in early September under his own name for a Friday evening in October, party of 4. I saw it flagged in the reservation system 3 weeks out, a small red notification on my phone that I stared at for a long moment before setting the phone face down on my desk and going back to the vendor contract in front of me. I didn't cancel the reservation. I didn't reach out to warn anyone. I let it sit there on the books, exactly as it was, the way you let a chess piece sit in position long after you've already seen the next 4 moves. But before I take you to that dinner, I want to go back and fill in something I skipped over, because it matters for understanding just how far the distance between us had grown by 2025, and it has to do with the binder, and with a night in July 2024 when I very nearly threw the whole thing away. It was a Sunday evening, unusually quiet at the house, Dennis Ruiz having texted to confirm both restaurants had closed clean for the night, no incidents, no emergencies. I'd poured a glass of wine, and for reasons I still can't fully explain, pulled the black 3-ring binder out of my office drawer and sat with it at my kitchen island, flipping through 4 years of documented dismissals. The $18,000 loan to Marcus, the property tax voicemail, a printed screenshot of my mother's Facebook comment on a cousin's post from 2022, reading, "Some of us just have different priorities in family, I guess," posted 2 days after I'd sent flowers for my grandmother's memorial service that nobody had told me the date of until it had already happened. A note in my own handwriting, dated November 2021, that simply read, "Thanksgiving, not invited. Marcus's debt, still unresolved. Total family contribution to Marcus since 2019, approximate $41,000. Total family contribution to me, ever, $0. I remember sitting there thinking, with a kind of exhausted clarity, that I could close the binder, put it back in the drawer, and simply let the last 4 years exist as they were, painful, past unlitigated, grief without evidence. Or I could keep it, the way Ruth had originally suggested, not as a weapon, but as a record, proof for the version of myself that sometimes, late at night, still wondered if she'd been the unreasonable one, if a single yes to a $60,000 loan really would have been such an unreasonable price for staying inside a family. I kept it. I want to be honest that keeping it wasn't, at the time, a decision made in anger. It was closer to what a good CFO does with a difficult quarter. You don't erase the numbers because they're uncomfortable. You file them accurately, and you let them tell you the truth later when you're ready to look at them clearly. That same summer, 2024, Larkspur's Rochester location crossed $1.3 million in annual revenue for the first time, largely on the strength of a private events program I'd launched the previous fall, catering rehearsal dinners and corporate retreats for a fee structure that ran 2 to 3 times higher margin than our regular dinner service. It was that private events program, in fact, that had eventually caught Hillcrest Manor's attention, since venues talk to each other the way small towns do, through referrals and word of mouth among event planners who all eventually cross paths at the same regional bridal expos and hospitality conferences. I also, that year, finally sat down with an accountant I trusted, a meticulous, understated woman named Grace Whitfield, to formally restructure how I held ownership across the 3 properties. Larkspur Syracuse, Larkspur Rochester, and Hillcrest Table had, until that point, existed as 3 separate LLCs with overlapping but slightly inconsistent operating agreements, a structure that had grown organically rather than by design. Grace helped me consolidate them under a single holding company, Cole Hospitality Group LLC, with each restaurant as a wholly owned subsidiary, and Walter Prentice's 15% minority stake carved out cleanly at the Hillcrest Table level, exactly where it belonged. It was a tedious process, for months of paperwork and legal review, costing roughly $22,000 in legal and accounting fees, but it left me, by January 2025, with a clean, defensible ownership structure, the kind of structure, I'd later realize, that would matter enormously once my family started asking questions they had no legal standing to ask. I mention Grace, and the restructuring specifically, because it explains something important about what happened next, in the months leading up to that October dinner reservation. Once Cole Hospitality Group existed as a single entity, and once the Enterprise Review article had circulated its way back to Everton Mills, my family's curiosity about the restaurant business stopped being vague. It got specific, and it got specific in a particular direction that told me exactly what kind of reconnection this actually was. In June 2025, 2 weeks after Danielle's wedding, my mother called, and after several minutes of surface-level small talk about the weather and a second cousin's new baby, asked almost too casually whether I'd ever considered bringing on family as the business grew. You know, the way some restaurant families do it, keep it all close. I told her I hadn't given it much thought, which was true in the sense that I had given it a great deal of thought and none of it favorable. She let the subject drop, that time, but it resurfaced again in August, this time from my father, who asked, during a call ostensibly about just checking in, whether Hillcrest Table might ever need someone to help with operations, maybe someone who knows the business world, a description that fit no one in my family less than it fit Marcus, whose most recent venture, the consulting service for aspiring entrepreneurs, had by that point produced exactly one paying client and roughly $2,400 in total revenue against advertising costs of nearly $6,000. I didn't say no outright to either question. That summer, I'd learned, by then, the professional value of letting a party show you their full hand before you show them yours. I gave non-committal answers, the kind that closed nothing and promised nothing, and I watched, with a strange and not entirely comfortable clarity, as my family recalibrated their approach to me in real time, testing which doors might open, all while never once acknowledging the 4 years the door had been shut, or the sentence my mother had spoken through it. You were never really one of us. By September, the questions had a name attached to them, even if nobody said it directly. Money. Not a loan this time. Nobody had the audacity, yet, to ask for one outright, not after everything. But an opening, a foothold, a way back into proximity with something that had grown large enough to be worth being close to. It was against that backdrop that my father's reservation for 4, under his own name, appeared in Hillcrest Table's booking system in early September for the second Friday in October, to celebrate what the note in the reservation system described, in his own words relayed through the online form, as 40 years since I started in this business. Figured we'd treat ourselves somewhere nice for once. I stared at that note for a long time. 40 years since he'd started at the auto parts counter, a job he'd since lost and quietly replaced with a lesser one. I understood, reading it, that this dinner wasn't really about his anniversary at all. It was about being seen somewhere that mattered, somewhere with white tablecloths and a wine list, at a moment when the family's finances had grown thin enough that such an outing would ordinarily have felt out of reach, a moment made possible, I suspected, by a fresh line of credit or a modest windfall I didn't yet know the source of. I told Dennis to make sure the reservation was handled exactly like any other, same table rotation, same service standards, nothing flagged, nothing special. I told him nothing about who Harold Cole was to me. I wanted, when that dinner happened, for my family to experience Hillcrest Table exactly as any other customer would, with no advanced knowledge on the staff's part that could soften or perform anything for their benefit. I wanted the truth of the place, its quality, its standards, its ownership, to simply exist in the room, unannounced, the way it always had. The night before that dinner, I sat once more at my kitchen island with the black binder open in front of me, and for the first time in 4 years, I didn't feel grief looking at it. I felt something steadier, something closer to readiness. Whatever happened at that dinner, whatever came after it, I understood I was no longer the daughter standing in a 600-square-foot attic apartment eating reheated rice while her mother talked about someone else's achievements. I was the owner of the room my father was about to walk into, and for the first time since October 2021, I felt something in me that wasn't quite forgiveness, and wasn't quite anger either. It was patience, the particular patience of someone who has finally stopped waiting for a door to open because she built her own. The second Friday of October arrived cold and clear, the kind of upstate New York evening where the light goes amber early and everyone's breath shows a little on the walk from the parking lot. I wasn't at Hillcrest Table that night. I want to be honest about that, because I've thought about it many times since, whether I stayed away out of self-protection or out of theater, giving the moment room to unfold without my face in it. Probably some of both. I was at Larkspur, Syracuse instead, working the floor for a private event, checking in by phone with Dennis every hour waiting. At 7:52 p.m., Dennis texted me, "Your father's party just sat down. Table 14. All good so far." At 8:41 p.m., a second text. He asked our server Marissa if the owner ever comes around. She said sometimes. He said, and I quote, "Must be nice. Some people just fall into a good thing." I read that sitting in my office at Larkspur, a stack of October invoices in front of me, and I laughed. Once quietly, not because it was funny exactly, but because it was so precisely, perfectly in character that it almost felt like relief. Proof that whatever had shifted in my life, my father's way of understanding it hadn't shifted at all. At 9:15 p.m., the last text came in. Ribeye came back once, said it was overcooked. Kitchen redid it. Otherwise fine. They left a decent tip, for what it's worth. Server said the older man complained about the wine markup on the way out. Said something like, places like this get away with murder because people don't know any better. I sat with that image for a long time after Dennis's text stopped. My father, 62 years old, eating a corrected ribeye in a restaurant he had no idea his own daughter owned, grumbling about the wine markup to a server making $18 an hour plus tips, a server who reported, ultimately, to me. There was no triumph in it. Not really. Not the kind you might expect. Mostly there was a strange, quiet sadness, the sense of a man still narrating a story about the world, and about me, that had simply stopped being true years ago, without his noticing. If you've ever watched someone you love keep believing something that isn't true anymore, just because the truth would cost them too much to accept, you know exactly the ache I'm describing. Let me know in the comments if you felt that too. That dinner became, without my planning it, a kind of hinge point. Within a week, my mother called again, this time with a specific ask rather than vague small talk. Marcus's consulting venture had, predictably, produced almost no income, and he and his girlfriend, a woman named Sandra he'd been seeing for about 8 months, were 3 months behind on rent for a small apartment in Syracuse, roughly $4,200 in arrears. My mother didn't ask me directly for money. Not yet, she asked, instead, whether I might be willing to have a conversation with Marcus about opportunities in the restaurant world. Since, as she put it, you clearly know how to make something work, and he's just never had anyone really show him how. I told her I'd think about it, and I meant it, in the narrow sense that I did think about it, carefully, for several days, running through what it would actually mean to bring Marcus into any part of Cole Hospitality Group, given his history. I called Grace Whitfield, my accountant, and asked her, hypothetically, what the financial exposure would look like if a family member with no restaurant experience and a documented pattern of failed ventures were given even a minor operational role or minority stake. Grace's answer was blunt. Vanessa, I've seen this movie. Family gets a foothold. Family feels entitled to more than the foothold, and 6 months later you're either buying them out at an inflated price or fighting them in court. If you're doing this out of guilt, don't. If you're doing it because he's genuinely qualified, show me the resume. There was no resume, of course. There never had been. It was around this time, in late October 2025, that I had the first of what would become several conversations with an attorney, a corporate and family business specialist named Preston Okafor, no relation to the journalist Jenna Okafor, a coincidence he found funnier than I did when I mentioned it. I'd found Preston through Walter Prentice's recommendation, and I went to him not because I anticipated a lawsuit, but because I wanted, for the first time in my adult life, to fully understand my legal position, what my family could and could not claim, what exposure I had, what protections Cole Hospitality Group's LLC structure actually provided if things got complicated. Preston walked me through it over 2 sessions, at his office on a quiet street near downtown Albany, a room lined with law books that looked more decorative than functional. He confirmed what Grace had already suspected, that because Cole Hospitality Group and each subsidiary restaurant had been properly restructured the previous year, with clean, documented ownership solely in my name apart from Walter's 15% stake in Hillcrest Table, my family had no legal claim to any part of the business, regardless of what verbal promises might be made or implied in family conversations. Family expectation isn't a legal instrument, Preston told me, tapping a pen against a legal pad. Unless there's a document, a will, a contract, an operating agreement naming them, there's no claim here. But I'll tell you something from 20 years of doing this kind of work, the absence of a legal claim rarely stops a family from believing they're entitled to one anyway. That sentence stayed with me through November. The intercepted moment, the one that finally showed me, without any ambiguity, exactly what my family's reconnection had really been about, came on Thanksgiving weekend, 2025, 4 years and 1 month after the Thanksgiving I hadn't been invited to. My mother, tentatively, almost nervously, had invited me back that year, the first invitation of its kind since the estrangement began, and I'd accepted, curious more than hopeful at that point, wanting to see the shape of things in person rather than filtered through phone calls and half-answered questions. I arrived at my parents' house on Larkspur Avenue, the same narrow blue house, though the porch had been repainted a slightly different shade of gray since I'd last stood on it, carrying a bottle of wine from Hillcrest Table's private label collection, something we'd started producing that year in partnership with a small Finger Lakes vineyard. My mother greeted me with a hug that felt, if I'm honest, both genuine and rehearsed, the kind of hug someone gives when they've been thinking about how to give it for days. My father shook my hand, an oddly formal gesture between a father and daughter, and said, "Good to see you, Vanessa. Business must be treating you well," gesturing vaguely at nothing in particular that indicated what well meant to him. Dinner itself was almost aggressively normal. Turkey, my mother's green bean casserole, small talk about the unusually mild November weather, Marcus and Sandra discussing a movie they'd seen. It was, in its surface texture, almost exactly the kind of family gathering I had once ached for, years earlier, in that attic apartment with my reheated rice. And for about 40 minutes, sitting at that table, some old part of me let itself believe, just slightly, that maybe this really was just a family finding its way back together, imperfectly but sincerely. That belief lasted until I stepped outside for air around 7:30 p.m., needing a few minutes away from the warmth of the dining room, and stood on the back patio in the cold, my phone still in my coat pocket. Through the kitchen window, cracked slightly for the oven's heat, I could hear my mother's voice, lower than her dinner table voice, talking to my Aunt Carol, who'd apparently arrived a bit later for dessert. "She's doing so well, Carol. You should see how she talks about it. 3 locations, and Preston said Marcus's rent could easily be covered if she just..." My mother's voice dropped further, and I only caught fragments after that, something about, if she'd just formalize something, give him a real role, a title even, it wouldn't cost her anything really, not with what she's making. And then my father's voice, closer to the window, saying, "Let me handle it. Elaine, I'll bring it up before dessert." Natural-like, not a big ask, just floating the idea of him coming on as some kind of consultant, get his foot in. We can build from there. Build from there. I stood on that cold patio for a long moment, my breath fogging in front of me, turning that phrase over. Preston's voice came back to me too. From weeks earlier, the absence of a legal claim rarely stops a family from believing they're entitled to one anyway. I went back inside for dessert. My father did, in fact, raise the subject, almost exactly as I'd overheard him plan to, framing it as a casual idea over pumpkin pie. Wouldn't it be nice if Marcus came on in some kind of advisory capacity, learn the ropes, maybe start with something small? I said, evenly, that I'd think about it, the same noncommittal answer I'd given all fall, and watched something flicker across my mother's face that looked almost like relief, as though "I'll think about it" had already been quietly upgraded, in her mind, into a yes. I want to pause here, because I think it's important to say plainly, I don't believe my father is a cruel man, even after everything. I think he's a man who spent 62 years believing a certain story about what mattered, steadiness, providing the visible markers of a real career, and who has spent the last several years watching that story collapse around him, his job gone, his savings thin, his son's ventures failing one after another, while the daughter he'd once dismissed built something enormous without his help. I think, in his own way, he genuinely believed that bringing Marcus into my business wasn't an imposition. He believed it was simply how families were supposed to work, the strong helping the struggling, never once accounting for the years he hadn't extended that same principle toward me. That doesn't make it acceptable. It just makes it human, and I think that distinction matters. The final piece arrived in early December, and it was the piece that made the shape of everything unmistakable. My mother visited Hillcrest Table for the first time, not as part of any family gathering, but alone on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly just wanting to see the place for myself, since I never have. I happened to be there that day, in the back office reviewing December's projected numbers with Priya, and Dennis called back to tell me my mother was seated in the dining room, and did I want to come out. I did. I sat across from her at a small two-top near the window, and for the first 20 minutes, the conversation was almost pleasant. She admired the exposed brick, asked genuine questions about the renovation, seemed, for a moment, like someone simply curious about her daughter's life. But then her questions shifted, subtly, The way I'd learned over the years that questions in my family always eventually shifted. She asked how many square feet the space was. She asked, with studied casualness, whether the building was owned or leased, and when I said owned, what the property might be worth. She asked about my house. She'd apparently heard, through Danielle, about the colonial with the wraparound porch, and whether I'd financed it or paid outright. She asked, finally, gently, almost gently enough that I could have let it pass unnoticed if I hadn't already heard her voice through that cracked kitchen window 3 weeks earlier, whether I had thought any more about Marcus, and whether I'd considered, maybe putting something in writing, even just informally, so he'd have something to build toward. I told her, calmly, that I hadn't made any decisions, and that I wasn't going to make decisions about my business based on family pressure rather than qualifications. She nodded, said she understood, and left not long after, hugging me at the door in that same rehearsed but genuine way, telling me how proud she was, a sentence I had waited 20 years to hear and that landed, in that moment, oddly weightless. I called Preston that same evening. I told him everything, the overheard conversation on the patio, my mother's visit and her questions about the property value in my house, the pattern of the last 4 months laid end to end. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Vanessa, I think you already know what this is. This isn't reconciliation. This is due diligence. They're not trying to get to know your life. They're trying to find out what it's worth and how much of it they can reasonably ask for without you saying no again. I didn't argue with him. 2 days later, my mother called with a request that had, finally, dropped all pretense of subtlety. She asked whether the whole family could come to Hillcrest table for a proper sit-down dinner. Just us, nothing fancy. The following Saturday, and whether, while we were all together, I'd be willing to really talk seriously about bringing Marcus on, and she added, almost as an afterthought that wasn't really an afterthought at all, whether I might also consider helping with some of the medical bills piling up from your father's hip situation, now that things are a little more settled. Between us, I said yes to the dinner. I did not say yes to anything else. And as I hung up the phone that evening, standing in my kitchen with the black binder visible through the cracked office door down the hall, I understood, with total clarity, that whatever walked through Hillcrest table's doors that Saturday would not be a family coming to reconnect with a daughter they'd missed. It would be a family arriving to collect on an investment they believed, without ever having said so honestly, they were owed. I spent the days between that phone call and the Saturday dinner doing something I hadn't expected to spend them doing, preparing, methodically, the way I prepare for any high-stakes negotiation, because that, I finally admitted to myself, was exactly what this had become. I went back to Preston Okafor's office on the Tuesday before the dinner, and this time our conversation was less theoretical. I asked him directly what documents I should have on hand if the conversation turned, as I suspected it would, toward Marcus's potential role in the business, or toward direct financial requests. Preston recommended I bring nothing dramatic, nothing that would feel like an ambush, but he did suggest I have, readily accessible, a clear, current organizational chart of Cole Hospitality Group showing ownership percentages, along with a simple summary letter, on firm letterhead, confirming that no family members held any ownership interest, board position, or employment role within the company. Not to wave in anyone's face, he said, just so that if the conversation drifts into assumption, you have something that ends the drifting quickly and cleanly. Grace Whitfield helped me put together that summary the following day, a single crisp page listing Cole Hospitality Group LLC, its 3 subsidiary restaurants, my sole ownership of Larkspur Syracuse and Larkspur Rochester, my majority ownership of Hillcrest Table at 85% with Walter Prentice's documented 15% minority stake, and a clear line stating that no other individuals held equity, employment, or advisory positions within the organization. I placed that page in a plain manila folder, and I placed the folder inside the black 3-ring binder, behind 4 years of documentation, where it belonged, the newest entry in a ledger that had started with a mental tally of unequal Christmases and ended, 4 years later, with a legal instrument. I also spent part of that week, oddly, thinking about Ruth Bennett, who had passed away the previous spring, in April 2025, quietly, of heart failure at the age of 64. I hadn't spoken about her much in this story yet, mostly because it's still hard for me to speak about her at all. Ruth had been at every important turn of my rebuilding. The neighbor with soup, the advisor at my kitchen table, the woman who told me a no is a complete sentence. And she wasn't there for the part that mattered most, the part where everything she taught me would finally be tested against the family that had made her necessary in the first place. I thought, going into that Saturday dinner, about what Ruth would have said, and I think I already knew. She would have told me to let the truth do the talking, and to feel nothing that resembled guilt about it. Sandra, Marcus's girlfriend, called me unexpectedly on the Thursday before the dinner. A call I hadn't anticipated and almost didn't answer, since we'd only met a handful of times and had never spoken one-on-one. She sounded nervous, apologetic even, and told me, in a rush, that she wanted me to know she hadn't been part of whatever it is the family's been planning, that she'd overheard enough dinner table conversation at Marcus's parents' place to feel uncomfortable, and that she just wanted me to know Marcus isn't a bad person. He's just never had anyone tell him no and make it stick. It was a strange, unsolicited kindness, and it told me something useful, that whatever was about to happen Saturday, there might be at least one person at that table capable of seeing the situation honestly, even if she wasn't the one with a voice in the family's decisions. I thanked her, and I filed that conversation away too, quietly, the way I'd learned to file everything that might matter later. By Friday evening, the day before the dinner, I had done everything I could reasonably do to prepare. The folder was ready. Preston was a phone call away if needed. Grace had the full financial picture organized in case anyone asked pointed questions about revenue or valuation. Dennis had, at my request, arranged for our best private dining room at Hillcrest Table, a space with a heavy oak table that sat 8 comfortably, tucked away from the main floor. The same room, coincidentally, where I'd once sat with Frank DeSalvo 3 years earlier reviewing the books of a failing steakhouse before I'd ever imagined it would become the place where I finally, fully closed the door on being unseen by my own family. I slept poorly that Friday night, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular restlessness of standing at the edge of something you've been building toward without fully admitting you were building toward it. I thought about the girl with the rusted bicycle chain. I thought about the attic apartment and the reheated rice. I thought about 11 seconds of silence on a phone call in 2021, and about the words "you were never really one of us," and about how strange it was that those words, spoken to wound me, had ended up being the words that set me free to become someone my family would eventually have to reckon with on my terms, in my restaurant at my table. Saturday arrived, cold and overcast, the kind of December afternoon that made the private dining room's fireplace, lit early by Dennis's staff, feel especially warm and especially deliberate. My parents arrived first, at 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes early, my father in a sport coat I didn't recognize, my mother in the same navy dress she'd worn to a cousin's christening years earlier. Marcus and Sandra arrived a few minutes after, Marcus visibly more dressed up than I had seen him in years, a fact that told me, before a single word was spoken, exactly how much he understood was riding on this particular dinner. I greeted them at the door of the private room myself, rather than letting a server show them in, because I wanted to see their faces in that first moment, in the space that was unmistakably mine, the exposed brick, the label on the wine bottles already breathing on the sideboard, bearing Hillcrest Table's own private vineyard partnership mark. My father's eyes moved around the room the way I imagine an appraiser's might, cataloging, calculating, and I watched him settle into his understanding of what all of this represented, dollar by invisible dollar, even as he smiled and said, "This is really something, Vanessa. Really something." We sat. Wine was poured. The appetizers came out, the same seared scallop dish that had been running on Hillcrest Table's menu since the spring, priced at $24 a plate. A fact I doubt any of them clocked, though I clocked it instinctively, the way I clocked everything in that room out of 15 years of habit. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation stayed safely on the surface, Sandra asking polite questions about the restaurant's history, my mother commenting on the wine, my father telling a long story about a customer at his new auto parts job that landed, as most of his stories eventually did, on a joke at his own expense that asked, quietly, to be reassured rather than laughed at. And then, as the entrees were cleared and the table fell into that particular lull that precedes dessert, my father set down his wine glass, glanced briefly at my mother in a way I recognized instantly as rehearsed, and said, "Vanessa, we wanted to talk to you tonight about something important as a family," and I felt the black folder, still sitting untouched in my bag beneath the table, take on a kind of weight that had nothing to do with paper. "Vanessa, we wanted to talk to you tonight about something important as a family," my father said, and I set my own wine glass down slowly, giving myself the extra second of stillness Ruth had always told me was worth more than any clever opening line. "Of course," I said. "I'm listening." My father cleared his throat, glanced again at my mother, and began the speech I suspect he'd rehearsed in the car on the drive over. "You've built something incredible here, and we're proud of you, we really are. But family takes care of family, and Marcus has been going through a rough patch, through no real fault of his own, and we think it's time this business started feeling like a family business, the way it should. We'd like you to bring him on, give him a real title, maybe advisory or operations, something with his name on the door eventually. And with your father's hip surgery coming up in January, and the bills that are already piling up from specialists, we thought, given how well things are going for you, that some help there would just make sense too. This is what family does, Vanessa." He said it warmly, earnestly even, the way people say things they've convinced themselves are simply obvious. I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered, not out of theater, but because I wanted to be sure my next words came from the calm place Ruth had spent years helping me build, not from the old wound underneath it. "I hear you," I said, "and I want to answer this honestly, because I think you deserve that, and so do I." I reached down, unhurried, and set the manila folder on the table in front of me, though I didn't open it yet. "Before I answer, I want to ask something. Mom, 3 weeks ago at Thanksgiving, I stepped outside for air, and through the kitchen window, I heard you and Aunt Carol talking. I heard you say it wouldn't cost me anything to give Marcus a title. I heard Dad say he'd float the idea, natural-like, and that you could build from there. I want to know, was any part of tonight actually about wanting to know me again, or has this, from the article, from the wedding, all the way to right now, only ever been about what I have?" My mother's face went through something complicated in that moment. I watched it happen in real time, a flicker of guilt quickly overtaken by defensiveness, the particular expression of someone caught holding a version of events they'd been telling themselves was more generous than it actually was. "That's not fair, Vanessa," she said, her voice rising slightly. "We're your family. We have every right to be part of your success. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch your own daughter build all of this and shut everyone out?" "I didn't shut anyone out," I said, keeping my voice level, though something in my chest had gone tight and hot. "You told me I was never really one of you. You said those words to me on the phone in October of 2021 because I said no to co-signing a loan for a business with no plan. I didn't disappear from this family. I was told I wasn't part of it anymore, and then I built a life anyway, without a single dollar or a single kind word from anyone at this table, and now that it's worth something, I'm suddenly family again." My father's composure cracked first, the way I think it always would have, since he'd never been as practiced at holding a narrative under pressure as my mother was. "You think this is easy for me," he said, his voice sharper now, leaning forward. "You think it's easy sitting in a restaurant my own daughter owns, watching a 22-year-old server bring me a bill I can barely afford, knowing you've got all this and we've got nothing? I lost my job, Vanessa. I'm 62 years old working a counter job for less than I made 20 years ago. Marcus can't catch a break to save his life. And you're sitting there acting like helping your own family is some kind of business transaction." "It became a business transaction," I said quietly, "the moment you decided my worth as your daughter was conditional on what I could provide. That happened in 2021. I didn't do that. You did." Marcus, who had been silent through all of this, finally spoke, and his voice had none of my parents' rehearsed conviction. It was smaller, uncertain. "Vanessa, I know I've screwed up. More than once. I'm not asking you to pretend I haven't." He glanced briefly at Sandra beside him, who reached over and took his hand, and something in that small gesture, the one honest moment at that table, made my chest ache in a way the rest of the conversation hadn't. "But I didn't ask them to plan anything behind your back. I didn't know about the window thing, I swear to you. I don't know how to fix my life, and everyone keeps telling me you're the answer, and I don't know how to say no to that when I don't have anything else." That was the moment, I think, when the room actually split into two different conversations happening at once. My parents' rehearsed entitlement on one side, and my brother's genuine, unrehearsed lostness on the other, close enough to sit at the same table but not, I realized actually the same thing at all. I opened the folder. "I'm not going to give Marcus a title in this company," I said, sliding the single crisp page across the table, the organizational chart with its clean lines of ownership, the summary letter on Preston's firm letterhead beneath it. "Not because I don't love him, and not to punish him for struggling. I won't give an ownership stake, a job, or an advisory role to anyone based on family obligation instead of qualification, because that's exactly the kind of decision that destroyed 3 separate businesses before this one, his own. This document confirms that Cole Hospitality Group has exactly 2 owners, myself and a business partner named Walter Prentice, who earned his stake by believing in me with real capital when I had nothing, and never once by being related to me." My father stared at the page for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not the defensiveness from a moment earlier, but something closer to the recalculating silence Ruth had once described, the sound of a story finally meeting evidence it couldn't argue with. "And to answer your question about the medical bills," I continued, my voice steady, "I will help you directly, Dad, with an actual number, a real plan, the same way I'd help anyone I love facing a real hardship, but I won't do it tonight, as a condition of a conversation that started with an ask for a title that hadn't been earned. I'll call Grace on Monday, and we can talk about what real help looks like, separate from all of this." "So that's it," my mother said, her voice thinner now, cracked in a way it hadn't been earlier. "You're just going to sit there and lecture us with a piece of paper." "No," I said, and this is the line I want you to remember, because it's the truest thing I said all night. "I'm not lecturing you. I'm telling you the difference between being loved and being useful, because I spent 30 years not knowing there was one, and I'm not confused about it anymore." The table went quiet in a way that felt different from every silence before it. Not tactical, not rehearsed, just heavy, the sound of 4 years of avoided truth finally landing in a room all at once. My mother's eyes were wet, though whether from shame or self-pity I genuinely couldn't tell, and maybe it didn't matter which. My father looked, for the first time that whole evening, and maybe for the first time in years, genuinely afraid. Not of me, I think, but of what it might mean if the story he told himself about being a good father, a good provider, turned out not to hold up under the weight of an actual accounting. I watched him glance down at that clean organizational chart again, at the number 0 next to every family member's name, and something in his shoulders dropped, just slightly, an old man's posture settling into a fact he could no longer outrun. "I didn't think of it like that," he said finally, quietly, not quite an apology, but closer to honesty than anything he'd offered in 4 years. "I told myself I was just trying to fix things for Marcus. I didn't think about what it cost you all this time, to watch us do that for him and never once for you. I didn't need him to say more than that. I don't think, honestly, that a man like my father was ever going to produce a tidy, complete apology in one dinner, and I'd stopped needing that from him somewhere around the 3rd year of silence. What I needed was simply for the truth to exist out loud, undisputed, at a table where it had been buried for a decade before it ever became a 4-year rupture, and for one moment, however brief it did. Sandra spoke up gently into the quiet that followed, looking at Marcus. "Maybe," she said, "the thing to actually ask for isn't a job. Maybe it's help figuring out what you're actually good at on your own, without it being tied to your sister's business." Marcus nodded slowly, looking, for the first time all evening, less defeated than simply tired, in the specific way people look when they've been carrying a plan that was never really theirs. Dessert came out not long after, the same burnt honey cake I'd eaten alone at Larkspur on my 30th birthday, 3 years earlier with no family present to notice, and there was something almost unbearably poignant about watching my mother take a bite of it, unaware of what it had once meant to me, unaware that the woman serving it that night had once celebrated turning 30 with nobody but a mentor and a bottle of decent Cabernet, because nobody at this table had thought to call. "Can I ask you something?" my father said, quieter now, the fight mostly drained out of his voice. "When did you know? That we were only coming around because of the article, I mean. Was it the wedding?" I considered the question honestly before answering. "I think I knew for certain the night Mom asked me, out of nowhere, whether the property was owned or leased," I said. "But if I'm being fully honest, some part of me suspected at the moment Mom's first text arrived in February, the one that said very impressive about the article, like I was a stranger who'd done something noteworthy, instead of your daughter you hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Love doesn't usually announce itself with very impressive. It announces itself by showing up before there's anything impressive to show up for. My mother flinched slightly at that, and I watched her open her mouth to argue, then close it again, as though she caught herself mid-defense and decided, for once, not to finish the sentence. I told Marcus, before dessert came out, that I would help him, not with a title, and not with capital, but with an honest conversation, the kind Ruth would have had with me at that same age, about what a real business plan looks like, what qualifications actually mean, and what it takes to build something on your own 2 feet rather than borrowed ones. I told him I'd connect him with a small business counselor, the same kind of resource I'd originally offered my parents for him back in 2021, before any of this had calcified into what it became. He said quietly that he'd like that. It wasn't everything. It was, I think, an honest door left open for the one person at that table whose failures had never really been engineered out of malice, only out of never having been told no and made to build something real in its place. My parents left that dinner without an apology tour, without tears turning into forgiveness on cue, because that isn't how real families actually work, however much this kind of story likes to tie things up cleanly. What changed, in the weeks that followed, was smaller and more honest than that. My father called Grace the following Monday on his own and asked what real help with his medical bills might actually look like, structured properly, without pretense. My mother has called twice since that dinner, both times with less performance in her voice than I'd heard in years, though I won't pretend the wound from those 4 words, "You were never really one of us," has fully closed, or that it should, simply because a truth finally got spoken out loud over a dinner table. I think about that 11-year-old girl with the rusted bicycle chain sometimes, riding it anyway, chain skipping every 3rd rotation, because she didn't yet know there was any other way to move forward. I think about the difference between being loved and being useful, and how long it took me to understand which one my family had actually been offering, and how much longer it took me to stop waiting for the first one to arrive disguised as the second. In the weeks after that dinner, I found myself doing something I hadn't expected, going back through the black binder, not to add to it, but to actually read it start to finish for the first time in years, the whole 4-year record laid out in order. Sitting at my kitchen island on a Sunday in late December, I turned every page slowly. The printed emails, the screenshot of my mother's Facebook comment, the note about Thanksgiving 2021, the tally of $41,000 given to Marcus against 0 given to me. I thought I might feel triumphant, reading it all at once, now that the truth had finally been spoken aloud at that oak table. What I actually felt was something quieter, and in its own way, more useful, a kind of closing of a ledger that no longer needed to stay open, because it had finally done the only job it was ever meant to do. It hadn't been a weapon in the end. It had been proof, kept safe until the day I needed to trust my own memory of what had actually happened, rather than the version my family had spent years quietly rewriting. Grace called me the following Monday, as promised, to talk through what real help for my father's medical bills might look like. We settled, over 2 conversations, on a structure that felt right to me, not a lump sum handed over out of guilt, but a defined contribution toward his specific hip surgery costs, capped at $18,000, paid directly to the surgical center rather than to my parents, with a clear, one-time understanding that it wasn't the opening of an ongoing account. My father, when Grace relayed the terms through me, didn't argue with the structure. I think, in a strange way, having clear numbers and a clear boundary was easier for him to accept than an open-ended, emotionally loaded gesture would have been. Numbers, it turned out, were something we both understood, even if we'd never once discussed them honestly before that December. Marcus took me up on the small business counselor referral in January, a woman named Odalise Reyes who specialized in working with first-time entrepreneurs on realistic, fundable business plans rather than optimism-driven ones. I checked in with him occasionally over the following months, not as his business partner, but simply as a sister, a role I realized, with some surprise, I actually wanted to occupy now that it wasn't tangled up with an obligation to rescue him. By spring, he had a modest, genuinely thought-through plan for a small mobile detailing service, financed through his own savings and a small, properly underwritten bank loan rather than family money, and while I don't know yet whether it will succeed, I know it's the first venture in his adult life that was actually built on a foundation rather than borrowed hope, and that alone felt like something worth being proud of him for. My mother and I have had, Since that dinner, a handful of careful conversations, the kind where both people are still learning the shape of a new, more honest relationship after years of an old, dishonest one. She has not, and I suspect never fully will, said the specific words I once needed to hear, an acknowledgement of a sentence she spoke to me in October 2021, the one about never really being one of his family. But she has twice now said something close to it in her own way, once telling me, quietly, over coffee at my house, that she thought about that phone call more than she'd ever admit out loud, and that she wished she could take back the tone of it, if not the underlying worry that had prompted it. I've decided, for my own sake more than hers, to let that count for something without pretending it counts for everything. I never did correct Aunt Carol's comment from the wedding directly, not in so many words. She found out the truth the way most of Everton Mills eventually found out anything, through Danielle, who apparently learned the full extent of it from my mother sometime after that December dinner, and who then, as cousins do, made sure the story circulated properly. I heard, secondhand, that Carol was mortified when she finally understood that the waitressing comment had been made at a wedding catered, entree, by her niece's own company. I didn't need to see her face when she found out. I'd already gotten everything I actually needed from that particular reckoning, sitting quietly inside a folder on an oak table in a private dining room that belonged to me. I think, often, about what Ruth Bennett would say if she could see where all of this landed. The dinner, the folder, the quiet 6 months of rebuilding something more honest than what came before. I think she'd tell me, in that dry, unsentimental way of hers, that I hadn't done anything particularly dramatic. I'd simply refused, finally, to let people rewrite reality faster than I could document the truth of it, and I'd let that documentation speak plainly when the moment finally required it to. I think she'd remind me, too, that the goal was never really revenge, however satisfying a well-timed folder might feel across a dinner table. The goal, all along, had been to stop needing anyone's permission to know my own worth. Here's what I want to leave you with, if you've stayed with me this long. You are allowed to build something extraordinary, even if the people who were supposed to believe in you first never did. You are allowed to say no to people who only remember you exist once you've become useful to them. And you are allowed, when the truth finally walks into the room, to let it speak for itself, calmly, without raising your voice, because the truth has never needed you to shout to be heard. It only ever needed you to stop being afraid of it. If this story meant something to you, I'd love for you to subscribe, drop a comment about which part hit hardest, and share this with anyone who's ever had to build their own worth from scratch after the people who should have handed it to them chose not to. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.